Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Barr, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the St. Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. As many of you already know, the Forum is an educational nonprofit with a mission to inform, entertain, and occasionally inspire by presenting artistic performances and exchanges of creative and innovative thinking on a wide variety of humanities-based subjects. Today, we're going to be talking about the surprisingly serious subject of laughter. To help us understand why it's such an important part of human and non-human behavior, we've asked Ms. Sasha Winkler to be our guest at the Forum. Sasha is a PhD candidate studying social behavior in non-human primates with a focus on communication, play, and learning. Sasha received her bachelor's degree in linguistics and cognitive science from Pomona College. She earned her master's degree in biological anthropology from UCLA, and before entering her PhD program, Sasha studied social networks, health, and captive welfare and rhesus macaques at the California National Primate Research Center at UC Davis. Her work there included intensive behavioral data collection for nearly 3 years. Sasha is also passionate about science communication and outreach and has held a variety of positions in science museums and education. She's currently collaborating on several K-12 outreach activities, so everybody please join me in welcoming Sasha Winkler. Hi, Sasha. Thank you so much for being with us today at the Forum.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the science, let me just ask you, how and when was it that you were first introduced to the subject of animal laughter, and what about that hooked you enough to continue on with research on that subject?
Yeah, so I have been studying primates for a long time. Pretty much I started in college as an undergraduate, and then after college and now as a PhD student, I worked with a few species of primates. So that's sort of my background in primatology. And I have watched a lot of primates play, but never really studied it before I went to graduate school. And I was very interested in the sounds that they're making or maybe not making. Especially, I used to work with rhesus macaques for a long time. And I noticed that maybe they're making some sounds during play, but maybe they were too quiet for me to actually hear them. And that's sort of what started my interest in the play vocalizations. I also was working with my collaborator, Greg Bryant at UCLA, and he's an expert in human laughter and the psychology of human laughter. And so we started talking about some of these really exciting theories about how human laughter evolved from a play vocalization, and that sort of got us both wondering more about how common that behavior is.
That makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense that the two of you would collaborate on this subject as well. In the paper that you wrote, in the preface of the paper that you wrote, which was co-wrote with him, was called Play Vocalizations and Human Laughter, a Comprehensive Review. And so I've used that one pretty extensively in looking for questions to ask you about this subject. The first question before I really get into that is, when he and you got together and started looking at material on this subject, did you find that there wasn't a lot of research, or that the research was there but it wasn't tied together?
Yeah, it was more the second, that there was research out there, but it wasn't really tied together. And our paper is a literature review paper. So it's sort of scholarly work that tries to look at what is out there in the scientific literature and synthesize and bring those ideas together into sort of more unified theory. So yeah, there was a lot of little disparate papers on play in animals and in human laughter, and also some very important work in primate continuity there, but not a paper that we could find that brought all animals together and tried to think about it as one phenomenon.
And I think that must be why you've gotten some notoriety based on this paper, because you have pulled it all together. In the preface of the paper, you talk about the fact that this review provides the foundation for detailed comparative analysis of play vocalization across diverse taxa, which is species, which can shed light on the form and function of human laughter and in turn, here's the key, help us better understand the evolution of human social interaction. A worthy reason for any research, it seems to me. So in essence, you've compared all of the available research that you could find on the subject of animal laughter and put it all together into this. Let's jump to the result of that. How many different species of animals do you find that laugh?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the big splashy headline that some people have written about this is there's 65 species that we found that vocalize during play or make acoustic sounds during play. But really, probably the number is higher. Like I said, we're just looking for what is out there, and a lot of animal species are not well studied, or maybe we missed a few mentions that were out there. We try to be as comprehensive as possible, but of course, there's some papers going back to the 1950s that we're looking at. So I'm sure there's more out there. That's just sort of a starting point.
So this is continuing work, I assume, on your part and others.
Yes.
So being ego-driven humans, when we talk about animal laughter, it immediately comes to mind that they must sound like us, right? So for example, we have a red fox. Let me show you a clip of a red fox. Okay, it's impossible not to laugh along with that red fox. I must say, I've seen that 100 times, and I still laugh every time I see that red fox. But in other species, and that one obviously sounds very much like a human laugh, but in other species, for instance, I have a clip of a dolphin. It's not so much. So let's take a look at the dolphin clip. Okay, it's laugh-inducing as well in the viewer, but at the same time, it's very obvious that that's not as human-sounding as the red fox. So when you're doing research, when researchers are looking at these animals, how is it that you say that one's laughing, that one's not laughing, if some don't sound at all like human beings? What is that thing that goes across all species, whether they sound like humans or not, that makes it possible for you to say that one's laughing? And then what's the evolutionary connection to human laughter from something like that dolphin?
Right, yeah. So it's a great place to start, because I think it gets at the heart of a few misconceptions about like the concept of animal laughter. So as a scientist, I have to have a caveat, which is I think the word laughter depends on how you are defining it. So if you define laughter as like the sound that humans are making in social situations and comedy, for example, then I would really restrict that word animal laughter just to us, or maybe our closest relatives, the great apes, who we know have a similar origin of the call. And I wouldn't really attribute it to the dolphins. I would just call that a play vocalization. But I guess, being more generous, if you want to define laughter as the function, which is this call that's made during play to sort of reduce the costs of play, which we can get into in a second, then maybe it's okay to call all these acoustic signals laughter. But yeah, that's just my scientific caveat with the word laughter. So I'm more comfortable using it with just great apes and humans than all animals. But I think your videos showed a great distinction, which is some of these sounds that animals make during play, like the red fox who's being tickled, sounds a lot like human laughter, to the point where it's contagious for us, right? Like we hear that and it's like hard not to laugh, like you said. And it's instantly recognizable sound. But in a lot of other species, especially ones that have much more different anatomy than us, like dolphins, their sounds are going to be very different. And actually, I'm not an expert in dolphins, so I'm not sure exactly what that sound is that the dolphin was making. It could be like some trained sound even, but that side of point, they do make these sounds only during play, which are like play-specific vocalizations, which function in the same way that we think like the ancestral human laughter did. So they're characterized as squawks and whistles and bursts. So they sound really different than it's not like all animals that laugh are chuckling and guffawing at us.
So realistically, the idea of animal laughter is really about play behaviors and vocalizations related to play behaviors. So the laughter part of it is not something that's dysfunctional in our conversation. So let's not talk about that. Let's in fact now talk about the importance of play. So okay, if the biological imperative for all species is to eat, drink, sleep in a place where a predator isn't going to eat you, and mate so you can keep the species alive. What's so important about play that animals of many species, at least 65 we know of, stop that biological imperative of finding some food and finding a place to... Why do they stop that to play? Why is play so important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think play is very puzzling. For one, for like people like me who study evolution, like exactly what you were kind of saying, it's not something that immediately seems like it would give you this additional Darwinian fitness, right? So it's not giving you additional offspring or leading to your survival or reproduction. So it's a little puzzling from that perspective. However, almost all mammals, especially when they're young, play, and a lot of other animals probably too. At least birds, we're pretty confident have a lot of play. So why is this behavior so ubiquitous when it's not clear what its function is? And part of the reason is that we think the functions of play or the benefits are delayed. So you play in early life to gain these sort of more intangible benefits later in life. There's a few hypotheses, like for example, play fighting in young animals might help them gain some skills that they can use as adults when they're actually involved in real aggression. And social play can help them, like these play fights can help them practice tactical moves, which they can't really do in a real fight because the stakes are so high. So it's sort of like a safe environment to practice some skills. And that sort of idea is also applied to play with objects. Maybe playing with objects can help young animals learn about the affordances of those objects. So learn about gravity or other physical properties by dropping things.
In the 65 species that you've identified, is play behavior and play vocalization, more importantly, is that only, which is what we're talking about, is that only used during play behavior, or does that sort of signaling of benign intent, for instance, during play fighting, and we'll get to that in a second too, is that used in any other contexts? Do we see that in mating? Do we see that in other contexts than just play?
Yeah, so these vocalizations that we were looking to identify are ones that are used specifically in that context of play. And ideally, for us to know that or be more confident that it's a play vocalization, it also shouldn't happen outside of play, like when they're being attacked by a predator, for example. And so going back to the whole reason that play is puzzling, I think another reason, other than we're not really sure, like the immediate function or immediate benefits, probably delayed benefits, is the behaviors that are used in play themselves are often behaviors that we see in other contexts. So play fighting, like I mentioned, is using lunging, biting, wrestling, these behaviors which are sort of modified from their more serious forms in real aggression. But it's sometimes hard to tell, right? If you imagine your pet dog and they're playing, sometimes it's like hard as a human to identify what's going too far, what's play, what's a real fight. And I think because of that ambiguity, even for animals of the same species, there is a level of ambiguity. If another dog came toward one dog and had their mouth open with their teeth bared, how do they know that it's not going to be a real bite and they should respond defensively versus a playful bite where they should respond playfully and not take it too seriously? So the idea of why we need play signals of any type, in dogs, they have this stereotyped visual signal, which is the play bow, where they go down on their elbows and put their rear in the air. Maybe you've seen this if you have a pet dog. And the function of those signals has been studied too. And when the signals are given, it helps to avoid escalation to aggression. So it sort of helps disambiguate that. So this lunge I'm about to do is not a real lunge. Don't take it too seriously. This is just play. That's sort of the message of those visual play signals. And we think that's the same function for these play vocalizations, animal laughter.
Gotcha. That makes sense. You see it, little children are playing rough and tumble play out in the backyard, and all of a sudden somebody's crying. So it goes from laughter to crying very quickly. And if you have that vocalization to let them know one to the other, no, I didn't mean it. You should calm down. Calm down. That makes some sense. You were talking about the play behavior in dogs, and it seems to me anybody in this audience who's ever had a dog has been a collaborator with that dog in play behavior. The dog comes to you, ball in mouth, and you've done this 100 times, and he sits in front of you, then bows, gets down on his forearms, four legs, I guess, and bows to you, and then gives you what's in the material is referenced to as a play face, which I think you've all seen your dog's play face. You know what that is. And then he waits anxiously, reading your signals, so that he'll know when you're going to throw that ball, when you're going to throw that ball, and then you throw the ball, and the thing then starts over and over and over and over. It seems to me, though, that that's more of a play collaboration between a human and a canine, and we see the same things. If you have a cat and a dog living together in the same environment, you see that there's often play between them, and it may be play teasing, the cat teasing the dog, or that kind of play, but it's a version of play. And I just wonder if you see that in the wild too. Is play behavior between species something that papers have been written about and that you talk about? For instance, if the opportunity arose, which seems unlikely, a mountain gorilla and an eastern lowland gorilla were together side by side at a border someplace, would they potentially play with each other? Or I know you've done a lot of primate, like Capuchin macaques and rhesus monkeys. Do they play together if given the opportunity, and do you see them in captivity playing together, or do they ever put them together in the same captivity? I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of cases of interspecies play, and I can think, like you said, of captivity. I've done some projects with looking at play in orangutans who are housed with siamongs, and they play with each other. So you definitely will see that. I think it's sort of interesting, as people, we're very interested in these interspecies communication events, and for some species they may be rare, but for more closely related species, like you said, maybe two subtypes of gorilla, I would imagine that they could definitely play together. And it might be harder for like a lizard and a fox,
a fish or something. Yeah, exactly. It'd be tough. Yeah,
and it's really different in size. It has to be one of the important features of play is that it has to be sort of low stakes and safe. So that's why you tend to see maybe two animals playing together. If they're different species, they're usually more similar in size, or maybe they're both predator versus a predator-prey relationship. Otherwise, it might be too scary.
Does the play vocalization translate across species? For instance, is the dog bringing me that ball, giving me any kind of a vocal signal that says this is just play, we're playing now? Or would the two gorillas be able to give any kind of an indication that this is play behavior and that you don't have to worry about me biting your ear, it's not real?
So we tend to think that these play vocalizations have evolved for within species communication. So because these signals evolved to reduce the costs of play and improve the benefits, usually those are thought of as within species benefits. However, it's definitely possible that other species could sort of learn to pick up on another species' calls. I mean, and of course, in the case of humans, we actively try to understand other species' vocalizations, but we're probably unique in that sense. I'm going to say it's possible that they pick up on that or learn it over time if they have exposure with the other species, or if it's a very similar sounding call. But generally, we think of these as play vocalizations that function to facilitate play within this, members of the same species.
Right. In the review, the paper that you wrote, you write that the regulation of social play in many species requires the use of visual and vocal signaling. We know that's what we've been talking about here. These signals help the animals clearly communicate intentions during interactions with where misunderstandings could have costly consequences. In other words, when they're about to play, they're about to do rough and tumble play. I'm going to bite your ear. That's part of the play. They make it clear with the vocalizations that that's what they're doing. I'm not really biting your ear. It seems to me that it would make a lot of sense if there was a version of that in the mating process. We alluded to this just a minute ago, but that kind of play can, if there was vocalizations that would in advance say, look, I am approaching you because I have mating in mind, as opposed to I'm approaching you because I want to fight with you. Or there's a prospective rival there, and you made it clear to that rival, okay, I have mating in mind. Are you big enough? Are you an alpha dog big enough to control me? Is there any of that you're seeing, because the behaviors of mating and play seem to some degree would be interchangeable? And so if there was any kind of vocalization in there, has anybody done any writing about that? Talked about vocalization during mating behaviors other than mating calls and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think you're sort of getting to the heart almost of like why communicate at all, right? And from an evolutionary perspective, there's certain like contexts where it might be really helpful to communicate your intentions to another to facilitate something like play or mating, something that's sort of pro-social that requires cooperation of two or more parties. But there's also signaling during aggression that can help reduce like escalation, even if there's low level aggression. It's sometimes helpful to have signals of aggression that reduce the cost for both. It's easier to just threaten another animal mildly and then get away scot-free than like really engaging in biting and wrestling where you could get seriously injured or even die. So that's a sort of the framework for how we think of like when signals evolve in animals in general. And more to your question about the mating signal, I mean, there could be some shared signals between mating and play. I'm not aware of like a lot of research on that, but I was reminded by your example of the dolphins that like some of the examples we found in our paper on play vocalizations have like sexual play is sometimes a category, especially in certain animals like dolphins who we are more like confident do that kind of behavior. So they have like one of the papers that we referenced was looking at just play fighting, but another of the papers in dolphins was found these certain kinds of squawk vocalizations that are happening in the context that they identified as sexual play. So I'm not sure exactly how they identified that, but it's sort of interesting that that there could be some context, especially in animals like dolphins or otters, who we know like have this sort of form of play, that they could have unique communication in that.
It seems like this is, I can see why you wanted to get involved in this whole concept, because it seems like there's a lot of room for more research in so many areas. Half these things are saying, well, somebody should do a paper on that. I keep thinking I should do a paper on that. Not that I could do it, but somebody should do a paper on that. I know that you covered in your papers, in all the literature you read, you talked a bit about marine animals. You just brought one up right there. What about birds? I know there are some birds listed in the material that you've worked on, Kia parrots, for instance, and a few others. But do they have play-specific behaviors and play-specific calls? Did you see any literature on that would say they do? And what I'm thinking of are the sort of the interactive play of chasing birds away from the nest and that sort of thing, but also murmuration, starlings, when 1,000 of them are like a school of fish in the air, and they all turn at the same time and make these amazing patterns in the air at certain times of the year. Does play vocalization have anything that resonates with that kind of behavior that you've read any papers on, any literature on that?
Yeah, so in birds, I will say also that some of these ideas about play in animals, until recent decades, have been sort of controversial. So a sort of controversial idea that animals play, or they play in the same way that humans might. And some people have been hesitant to say that any non-mammal animals play at all. So there's been some vigorous debate in the scientific community. Although I think now there's more acceptance that certain birds definitely have social play and probably object play. There's these fun videos on the internet I've watched of birds who like to sled down snow.
Yeah, you see tons of those. Yeah, exactly.
And it's helpful to identify play in those birds. It's repetitive. They're sort of doing it of their own volition. They seem to be enjoying it. So anyway, that's just another caveat that there's not a lot of research on play in birds in general, but there's a few species that we found that have well-documented play vocalizations. And so that was kind of an exciting part of our research, is to show that play vocalization is this phenomenon that happens not just in mammals, but also probably in some birds. And I think the most interesting example is that of the Kia parrot, just because there's been some really interesting research on their play vocalization. So this team of researchers led by Schwing et al. Did what I think is a really cool experiment where they played, so they identified a play-specific call in the Kia parrot, which is a parrot that lives in New Zealand, and they make this call called the warble call during play with each other. So when they're, doing their parrot version of play, I don't know what that looks like exactly, but they have this warble call. And the researchers did a study where they played that sound, the pre-recorded sound from speakers, called a playback experiment, to some birds out in the wild. And the response of the birds is really interesting. So when the birds just heard the sound of the warble call, many of them spontaneously started playing themselves, which kind of suggests that there is a contagion in the sound, much in the same way we think that human laughter is contagious, that for these Kia parrots, and they just hear the play sound, it put them maybe in a more playful frame of mind, and then they spontaneously started playing. So we can actually show a video of that.
Yeah, let's do. In fact, I was just going to ask you, I think that was the next thing I was going to say, I know you brought some videos with you. Why don't you do a show and tell for us and just work through a few of them? It should be really interesting.
Yeah, so this first video of the Kia parrots is from that paper I was referring to, the Schwing et al. Study. Yeah, so in the video, you can see that just hearing the sound that was played, but you can rewind it if it's a little fast, but just hearing the sound of the play call made the Kia spontaneously start playing with each other. There's some researchers who have done previous work showing that in the great apes, their play vocalization, so all great apes make this type of vocalization when they're playing with each other in social play, also when they are tickled. So actually I can start by just showing you a video of a baby bonobo being tickled, and you'll get a sense of the sound that they make.
See that?
And yeah, again, those are this is a bonobo that's in a sanctuary in Africa, I believe. I wouldn't recommend going out and trying to find baby bonobos and tickling them, because they can also be quite dangerous, or their parents at least. So anyway, so you can see, again, this sounds so much like human laughter that it's hard not to sort of smile or laugh yourself when you watch the video. And so all great apes make a sound like this in social play and also when they're tickled. They also tickle each other. It's not just human researchers tickling them, but that's how we can get the best audio clips as scientists. So that's a bonobo, but also chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all make a sound like that. That's their play vocalization. And for a long time, even going back as far back as Darwin, scientists have been talking about like, that's interesting. It's in a similar sort of playful context as human laughter, and it sounds similar. So more recently, using like newer technologies, acoustic comparisons of the actual sounds themselves, researchers, and this work is led by Marina de Villa-Ross and others, have shown that just using the acoustic properties of the sounds of all the great apes and human laughter, you can reconstruct a phylogeny of the great apes. So that's like, you can reconstruct their known evolutionary relationships that we know based on genetic information. So our play vocalization, which is laughter, sounds most similar to that of the chimpanzees and bonobos. Maybe I can play a chimpanzee laughter clip too. And then less similar to human laughter, it would be the gorillas.
Smiling.
So yeah, that's another video of human tickling a like infant gorilla, but just gives you a sense of like, there's also a facial expression, right, that corresponds with the sound.
It's so much fun to watch them. It's so much fun to watch them. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just we're going to be talking about contagion in laughter, but it is absolutely, there's something to it. It's absolutely true, and I think someplace I've read along the way that they can trace the chimpanzee laughter back several generations to nearly 1 million years ago. There was one chimpanzee that began that kind of behavior. I don't know how they could possibly have figured that out, but apparently they have.
Right. Well, so yeah, it's not like one chimpanzee. Of course, it's like one ancestor of all the great apes. So one of the strongest pieces of evidence, I think, for that actually is this like acoustic reconstruction of the phylogeny. So because like the sound has drifted in the same amount as the genetic difference, we're pretty confident that there was an ancestral call. It's called like a homologous vocalization, which basically just means like there was one ancestor of all great apes that probably had a sound that they made during play that sounded like the ones you've been hearing with the chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. And then as our sort of evolution diverged, we speciated, right, from humans and other great apes. And so in humans, that sound evolved into laughter. And then in chimpanzees, that sound evolved into what their current play vocalization sounds like. And in bonobos, that also evolved into their current play vocalization. So so I think it's a really neat piece of evidence that shows that human laughter probably evolved from a play-specific call made by a great ape ancestor. And so another thing that's interesting about that is then why is human laughter, you could see it in a way as our play vocalization, but then it also happens outside of play, and we do it during conversation, and we do it in a lot of different contexts. So I think a really interesting comparison is then why is human laughter outside of the play context, and why do we see that? Like, what is the evolutionary purpose of human laughter outside of play?
Do any of the studies that you ran, do you have any more videos and things you want to show us? I don't want to cut into your show and tell. Do you have more videos you want to show, or should we move on to a few other subjects to chat?
We can move on, although the last great ape one that I have is the orangutan, which would be the most distantly related genetically to humans, and so their play vocalizations, again, they're pretty similar, but they're acoustically the furthest away as well. So we can play that.
Yeah, great.
Okay, So that's the orangutan play vocalization. But yeah, we can move on.
Did you, in any of the studies you read, did you find any studies about non-mammals, that would be reptiles and fish and that sort of thing, that had any kind of play involvement, or obviously maybe not vocalization if it's a fish, but but anything that related to this? Because if in fact evolutionarily we do play for biological reasons to keep us alive, then you would think that would go to all species, not just to mammals, and there would be play in other species. Have you seen any work that's been done on that?
Yeah, it was really hard to find anything like that, and I think the reason is because of just skepticism in general that non-mammals play, and I think the skepticism is less in birds than reptiles or amphibians or other taxa fish. It's just hard to study, and there's some cases people have tried to raise, like maybe there's some fish that play with bubbles, but it's so hard to rule out that there's another function to some of those behaviors, like maybe they're blowing bubbles.
Or to get somebody to take you seriously if you say, those fish are playing with bubbles, I know that's a play behavior, that would be a little tougher to sell to your supervising professor.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to study, and I will say also, like, not all animals that play we would expect to have play vocalizations. So we really expect that in these cases of social play that have high costs potentially. So like species that have social play fighting would be the most, like, the best candidates. But some species don't do a lot of social play. Like if they don't need to develop fighting skills, if they're not really social animals to begin with, they might do a little bit of solitary play when they're young and then stop playing in adulthood. So
right. So play is it's really a factor more of play than play vocalizations, which are much more specific to certain reason to do it, to show benign intent. So that makes a lot of sense. It's hard to imagine Charles Darwin somehow tickling a chimpanzee, but I read a quote from him. He said, the anthropoid apes, this was in 1872, he said that anthropoid apes, as we have seen, likewise utter a reiterated sound corresponding with our laughter when they're tickled, especially under their armpit. So it's hard to imagine Charles Darwin tickling the armpit of a chimpanzee, but apparently he did 150 years ago or so, and that makes me laugh. But besides that, it makes me also wonder why, and I think you've kind of hit upon it already, is why so little research has been done on this. If we've done 65 species, which is a lot, and you guys have pulled that off to find out that that's what they've come up with, but if Siri can be trusted, there are 1.2 to 8.7 million different species on the planet. So we've got a lot of ground to cover if we're going to do this. And is the reason that there hasn't been more research in this area, which seems so ripe for more research on so many different angles and entry points, is that because it just is so darn difficult to do?
Yeah, like, so play is hard to study in general, partly due to the ambiguity that I was referencing earlier. Like the behaviors themselves often are borrowed from other contexts. And so it's just hard to identify in animals. But I will also say, like, it is just the nature of science. Like, there actually has been a lot of research on play in various animals, and the sounds that they're making are sometimes mentioned in these disparate papers. But so it's not that, like, I just came up with this idea originally, but, as is the nature of science, like, it's a process of sort of expansion and synthesis. And I think one of the contributions, hopefully, that our paper did was just try to synthesize, like, all this other research that has been sort of dribbling out over decades into one place and say, this is the same phenomenon. It has a similar function across a lot of animals, even in birds and mammals. And also probably human laughter originated as this type of play vocalization.
Right. Right. Although there are similarities that exist in vocalizations across species, we've talked about that. There's also this great variation. We're talking about that too in all of these different species, as we've seen even to the point of ultrasonic trills in rats. How do you, as researchers and doing the kind of work you're doing and putting together all that's been written about these things, how do you decide what bucket to put these things in when it's like, you could have two species, for instance, that had similar vocalization, but they're completely different. If you had the barking of a harbor seal and the barking of a canine, they're completely different animals, yet at the same time they both bark. How do you categorize that? And how do you make these different buckets to determine where you put these animals that you're studying?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think our starting point was just to look for research that had been done in that had first sort of identified play in those animals, and then look at what their sounds were that they were making, if any. And one of the findings of our paper was, or one of the things we try to do is sort of see if there's any similarities in the properties of the sounds that animals make during play. And one of the most common ones we found was this chuckling or panting kind of sound that is like similar to the great ape sound that we heard. And that was really interesting to us because we were trying to look for evidence for this theory that so we think that human laughter evolved from this breathy panting play vocalization, but there's also a theory about that ancestral vocalization that it evolved from a cue of play, which was basically heavy breathing. So in play, I mean, like you're wrestling, you're running around. So there's going to be this cue of labored breathing, and that is sort of material that evolution could act on if it's accentuated over time to turn that cue into a signal of play that's sort of more exaggerated. So that's the theory about where human laughter came from. It was originally this maybe cue of play, heavy breathing, which then through natural selection and many generations, of course, turned into a more exaggerated panting sound, which was a signal of play. And then it turned into what we have now is a really loud, really like sort of stereotyped signal. So that was one thing we're looking for in the sounds across all animals. And we found that in a lot of primates and a lot of these social carnivores, like the fox that you mentioned, is kind of a similar sound. However, we also noticed other patterns, like there's, some species that bark. You said like the sea lions and dogs. Dogs actually have like several different types of play vocalization. So they have a play-specific bark, a play-specific growl. It sounds different than the growls they do when they're actually fighting, and maybe even a play pant. There's a little bit of research on that.
I was going to ask you about that, as a matter of fact. Is there such a thing as a breakdown in their play vocalizations? For instance, if you want to play tug of war with your dog, does he bring a rope and make it a growl as opposed to a bark or a bow? And vice versa, if he brings a ball, does he make a bow and a different vocalization? So there is some definition maybe in the play behaviors that they're doing to indicate to whoever their play partner is that this is what we want to do. Could it even be extended to, I'm going to be the one who's going to be the aggressor and you be the one who's going to be the victim of my play behavior, which is all benign intent?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure in dogs, but like there are several different types. Some of them might be like slightly redundant, right? They might bow and then bark and kind of for the same message. But I think a really interesting case is in rats, who also are very well studied, right? Like the laboratory rat is like the most well studied animal. So there's been a lot of great research on play in rats, and they have this ultrasonic sound that they make, which isn't audible to human ears. So it's amazing that researchers even discovered this. But they have this ultrasonic class of vocalizations they make when they're playing with each other, and also when they're tickled, similar to the primates. And maybe we can play a video or show some sound of that too. Yeah. So anyway, I think it's a cool video. It's, the rats make this with each other, right? It's evolved for within species communication. But when they're in the laboratory, a human can sort of play with them with their hand, and sometimes the rats will even chase the human's hand around like as if it was a rat. So they kind of like being tickled and played with in this way, and they'll make the same kind of sound. But anyway, sorry, I got a little off topic there. But what I was trying to say is that in rats, they have multiple different kinds of these ultrasonic 50 kilohertz vocalizations that they make during play. And there's research that has shown very, very nicely, I think, that even within those types of vocalizations, certain types, like certain trills or chirps or whatever it is, can be used to coordinate specific moves during play in rats. So like, you don't think of rats as maybe the most complicated animals, but their play is super complex, and they pin each other down and, are trying to bite each other's necks. And so some of those more complicated reciprocal moves, like pinning and being pinned, are associated with like specific types of play vocalizations.
Oh, that's very interesting. I think we were going to touch on that a little bit in a few minutes, so we'll go back to that. Let me just ask you this: can you clarify for me in your paper you mentioned some play behaviors involve physical exertion and thus heavy breathing and panting. We've talked about that, and through what's described as a ritualization process, that kind of panting evolved into communication of benign intent during play fighting. So that my question is, okay, now you're panting. I get how that sounds like laughter. What I don't understand is how that then gets translated by the play partner as benign intent. Can you help me understand that?
Yeah, so it's a process of it's hard to understand, I think, in part because it's a process of natural selection, and so the time scale over which this happens is just almost incomprehensibly long, right? So if you're not used to thinking of that like evolutionary time scale, I think it can be difficult. But so it's not that they're learning, not that these animals are learning to associate that, but that over evolutionary time, those that are slightly better at communicating during play, right? Maybe the play pant becomes slightly more exaggerated. That might give them a slight advantage. And those that are more easily able to pick up on that signal might also have a slight advantage. So you see like selection on the signaler and selection on the receiver of the signal. And so over very long periods of time, those that have this like slight advantage in communicating during play will be more likely to survive and reproduce and have offspring. Then those offspring will have a slightly exaggerated call during play. And then on until what started as just heavy breathing is like this thing in the great apes. It's like, right? It's like not exactly heavy breathing, but you could see how it could evolve from that.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It seems conceivable that the play vocalization in elephants, do we have a clip of that elephant clip? Could you play that? That kind of play could have evolved from breathing, just like great apes, becomes a laugh and it becomes a play vocalization because they're breathing through their trunks. Let's take a look at that and you can see what that is. It's a particularly useful clip because I'm going to refer to that later. Remember, he's chasing that blue bin around, which is a tease. It's an offer and takeaway teasing that's being done, and that's what's making him laugh. But then we also have vocalizations in killer whales. So how do you determine that that's a play vocalization? How would we know that that's a play vocalization if it is in fact a play vocalization? And what's the vocalization about if it isn't about play?
Right. So you like this is like several questions in one. But yeah. So the elephants have a play specific trumpet, and orcas I believe have this like V4 class of calls that they make during play. So One thing I think this is just nice, like these videos demonstrate, is it's not like every animal sounds like humans or sounds like the great ape calls. There's a huge diversity of sounds that happen across the animal kingdom in play, and maybe some of these evolved from something in the breath, like maybe in the elephants in the trunk. But it's also possible that other play vocalizations have evolved from some other cue, or basically the shared thing is the function. They need some signal during play to communicate that their behaviors are playful and not aggressive, or that they have benign intent, like you were mentioning. But the way that evolution has solved that puzzle might be a little different in different animals. So the orcas, I'm guessing that's not from panting, right? Because they just breathe in such a different way than us. But I think it's a really nice way to show that there's, in other animals too, like there's play peeps and squeaks and chirps. And so there's this really beautiful diversity of sounds that can happen during play. And to your question about how we know these are play vocalizations, so in the work that I've done, I'm looking at already published research on play, but in my own work that I've also done with primate play, like the researchers on the ground are doing the work to sort of identify play behaviors based on some criteria that separate them from other types of behaviors, like some modified version that's different than aggression, for example. And then they're just recording or reporting on the sounds that are happening, like whether there's any acoustic signaling. So that's how we know they're play vocalizations, is that sort of by definition, we're restricting that definition to acoustic sounds that happen during this pre-identified context of play. And I mean, you could say maybe that's not entirely fair, because for human laughter, that is not only in play. So we're making a more restrictive definition for animals, just so we have a starting point.
Gotcha. And in fact, on that note, you write in your paper, people laugh in almost any possible situation and in contexts associated with any identifiable emotional state. For instance, you say, we have the potential to laugh when we are in despair, when we are disgusted, when we're joyous, or when we're bewildered. Many philosophical works are focused on laughter's so-called dark side, with connections to teasing, taunting, and schadenfreude. Can you expand on that and help us understand how it's possible that the simple goals of animal vocalization being about benign intent while doing play, rough and tumble play, how that's evolved into such a complex thing for human laughter, for human beings, how we use it in so many bizarre ways?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a question, and I think is super fascinating. But some of the things we know, like for example, we know that this sound, if laughter, probably changed from the original play context after we diverged from chimpanzees and bonobos, and a lot of other things have happened since then too. So right, we have language, which comes along with a lot of cognitive changes, but also physical changes, like in control of the breath, and a lot more controlled vocal vibration. So a lot of things come along with the changes we see, and including social reorganization. So the question is what is going on with laughter that can teach us about these differences between human social behavior and great ape social behavior. And some of the interesting things about human laughter is it's used in conversation often as a pragmatic marker. So there's this possibly other type of laughter that we call voluntary laughter, as opposed to spontaneous laughter, which is maybe what you're doing if you're wrestling or think something is really funny. It's sort of more genuine perhaps, or belly laughter. It sounds different, and the context is a little different than voluntary laughter. If you just ask someone, okay, laugh, right? You can imitate a laugh. You can voluntarily produce a sound that sounds just like that. but it's more like with speech apparatus and also possibly different neural control, which is more similar to speech than the spontaneous laughter, which is more similar to the neural circuits that are used in animals to produce the same call.
That's, I guess, the difference between volitional and Duchenne's laughter. I remember reading that Duchenne's laughter, it's a scientist years ago that came up with that, Mr. Duchenne, I guess. At any rate, he talks about how the laughter really becomes obvious when it gets into your eyes. That's not just made-up laughter. I can laugh right now. That's totally fake. But I can't fake it and get it all the way into your eyes in the way it crinkles in the edges and all. And that was Duchenne's laughter, and that's similar to what you're saying. I'm going to bounce around a little bit because I think we're probably getting close to our time limit. I'm not quite sure, but I think we are. And I just want to talk to you about teasing, because I know you've done some writing on teasing, and that's an interesting play behavior because, because we do things that we have to understand the other partner in the tease has to understand our minds, what we're thinking about when we do this. In fact, you write, in the offer and withdraw tease, there's a necessity for the teaser to understand the thought process of the one being teased in order to anticipate that the offered ball, or in the case of that little elephant we just saw, the offered big blue bin with probably a little bit of food in it. The anticipation is that how you're reading that little baby elephant's mind is that you know he's going to be interested in that food, you know he's going to then reach for that food, and you know how he's going to react when you jerk it away. And so that kind of a complex relationship in teasing it's like a joke being told, and the punchline is, and you jerk it away, and then it evokes laughter. Is that ability in animals to understand the thought processes of another partner sort of the same thing? In fact, we talked about this before, the same skill that humans have to read facial movement and facial tics in what psychologists call theory of mind. Is there a similarity in what's going on in teasing and theory of mind?
Yeah, this is a great question. So another area of my research for my PhD is with my advisor, Erica Cartmill, and her lab. And so we are looking at this playful teasing behavior in great apes. And so I want to also just mention that it's unlike the play vocalizations research that I do, which is sort of expansive, trying to look at as many species that we can. This playful teasing, we're not totally sure happens in any animals besides the great apes. So that's what sort of our starting point there. But the impetus for that research is that trying to think of the origins of humor in humans. We know that infants, when they start, where do we start? How do we learn humor? Pre-verbal infants, before they can even talk, do these sort of non-verbal teasing type behaviors, and one of those is, like you said, offer and withdraw. So even little babies who can't speak yet can appreciate maybe some humor in if you hand something and then yank it away, and hand something and yank it away. So we were thinking, if this is not if language is not a prerequisite for that in development, perhaps also in evolution, we could see some of that appreciation in animals that don't have language. So we were looking at the great apes and found examples of this offer and withdraw in the great apes. And it's accompanied with play signals. So my research on play vocalizations is super helpful for understanding this, because it's not always an aggressive thing, this teasing behavior. Sometimes it seems like both of the apes are enjoying it, and they'll make a play face or even laughter or other signals. So that's sort of our interest in that teasing behavior as sort of cognitively complex, like you said, could involve theory of mind. There's some expectation involved in reaching out an object that, the teaser's modeling the teasee's reaction, and vice versa.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right ahead to the next one, which is not dissimilar, and it's tickling. You wrote that tickling can result in the closest context that connects human laughter to other primate vocalizations, exaggerated panting, squeaks, and grunts, as we've been talking about, directly triggered by rough and tumble play. The complexity in laughter generated by tickling, though, also becomes apparent as during tickling, human laughter can sometimes become intermixed with other vocalizations that communicate distress, including screaming and crying. Everybody can remember their big brother or big sister sitting on them and tickling them until you can't breathe. That's distress, and so we know that those behaviors are human. Is that a purely human tickling reaction, or is that something that we see in other animals? And also, is that a power dynamic? Is tickling used as a power dynamic between these different animals? And do we see that in apes? And do we find in tickling rats that they get overstimulated? Enough with the tickling, do they say? Or do you sense that they burn out on the tickling? I know that's a lot of questions all in one.
Yeah, no, this is all super, super interesting. I'm not sure that there's a great the jury is still out, I would say, on the science of tickling and what's actually happening there. But yeah, I agree. It's super interesting thinking about some of these behaviors of play that sort of border on a power dynamic, or could border on teasing and negative teasing, or even aggression. And how do, it's difficult to toe that line for us, and maybe for animals, there's sort of a delicate balance of things you can get away with before you go too far, and sometimes things like tickling could sort of veer into the negative. So
exactly.
That's interesting to me.
Exactly. I think we're running out of time, but let me see if I can squeeze in a couple more questions. Here's one that I found particularly interesting. This is about group laughter and contagion, how laughter can be contagious. We talked about just briefly that. In 1962, an outbreak of uncontrollable laughter was reported in a girls' school in Tanzania, and it spread from village to village, and it lasted 16 days, in which young women, young girls primarily, starting there, but then whole villages couldn't stop laughing. They didn't, and it lasted, and local medical officers called it the laughing disease, and over 1,000 people were afflicted by this. This is in 1962. Obviously, that's an extreme case, but we've all been in situations when you get the giggles, as they say. Your friend looks at you at the funeral and starts to giggle, then tries to suppress it, and both of you try to suppress it, and then you have to leave the room because you can't. I've had actors in shows I've been working with who have gotten the giggles, and we have to cut the scene and stop until they can go get a cup of coffee and get past that. Has anything been written about how that kind of contagion in laughter happens, why it happens?
Yeah, that's also a great set of questions. And I hate to be the scientist is the wet blanket, but I have looked into that case of the girls' epidemic of laughing a little bit, and it might not be as clear cut as it seems. It sounds like there was a lot of exaggeration in the retelling of that. But that aside, of course, everyone's had the experience where they're laughing and they can't stop, or maybe they're laughing when they shouldn't be laughing. I think it's one of the best parts of watching improv or SNL, for example, is when the actors themselves can't stop laughing, right?
Exactly.
They break the
exactly.
So yeah, what is that about? And I think that's super interesting. One thing that I'm interested in as a comparative researcher on contagion is what are these basic biological processes that could underpin contagion? And if we see some form of contagion in chimpanzees in their laughter and even Kia parrots, then there maybe is something really sort of biologically fundamental about the way that the laughter works, where maybe hearing that sound induces an emotion which can create this spontaneous laughter that's difficult to control. So I think that's...
It makes sense. Robert Provine, the researcher, said that individuals laugh 30 times more often when they're in the company of other people than they do when they're alone. What do you think are the evolutionary rewards of shared laughter? Why would we do that? Why is that biologically interesting that we can't seem to not laugh if other people are laughing?
Yeah, so I think one reason is like it's pleasurable for us to like share emotional states with other people, right? And that's how like friendships are formed and social bonds are formed and maintained, is like these shared positive experiences that we have with other people. One thing that we haven't really talked about about human laughter is it, but that's unique about human laughter, to say, compared to like the play vocalizations of other animals, which usually just happen in pairs, right? When they're playing in like a dyad, is that we have these group functions of laughter. So laughing together in a group sort of can create like group cohesion. And if you like get the joke, it can show that you like understand some shared common ground in the group. Another thing about human laughter with the group, like social functions, that seems unique is that other people seem to be able to infer like relationships by just hearing other, like if a listener hears two other people laughing, they can tell whether they're acquaintances or like good friends. So think about like the awkward laughter you might do with someone you first met versus like a big belly laugh with your best friend. It seems like that communicates something about the relationship to others.
Yeah, I read. I think it was a piece of that in your paper that worldwide they've done studies on people who are given the audio of a group of people laughing that know each other very well, and a group of people laughing that don't know each other very well at all, barely know one another, and inevitably the listeners could tell just off the street which is which. They knew which was a group that knew each other, that were familiar with each other.
Yeah, and I would just note that that's the work of that is Dr. Bryant, who's my collaborator on.
Oh, there you go. So there you go, and that's, I found that to be very interesting. Well, I think I've got more questions, but I think we have hit the limit on our time. So, Sasha, I just want to say thank you so very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. This is a great conversation. It's easy for me to talk endlessly about this topic, so thanks for the great question.
I wish we could. I'd love to be able to go on longer with this. What's the next research you're working on? I think it was bonobos and something, cognitive research in bonobos. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so for my dissertation, I'm still looking at play vocalizations, but I'm focused just on bonobos and humans and trying to compare some of the cognitive effects of listening to, in case of humans, human laughter, and for bonobos, their version of bonobo laughter, and whether there's any similarities in like the cognitive effects that it has on us to just listen to that sound.
Interesting. Sounds great. Maybe we can have you back and we'll talk more about laughter play behavior, and you'll tell us how your research worked out in this case. So it's been terrific to have you here. I won't say it's been a lot of laughs, but I can resist that bad fun. But thank you so much for being with us.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye. Whether a human or a bonobo, according to the Mayo Clinic, there are a multitude of physical health benefits to laughter. Laughter can increase your oxygen intake, which can in turn stimulate your heart, lungs, and muscles. Laughing releases endorphins to make us happy and even relieve pain or stress. Laughter can boost our immune system's response through the release of stress and illness-reducing neuropeptides. Laughter signals cooperation, a key aspect of human survival, and promotes a healthy body to boot, which is the best reason I can think of to grab a glass of wine and share a few laughs with some friends. To learn more about Sasha's work, please go to her website, sashawinkler.com. If you'd like to learn more about the forum or to watch archived programs or find information about upcoming presentations, please visit our website, shforum.org. Our audiences have joined the forum from right here in St. Helena, from all over the states and more than 30 countries. They represent old, young, and in between. They are academics, laymen, artists, scientists, journalists, students, and anyone interested in innovative and creative thinking. We hope you've enjoyed yourself tonight and learned something you didn't know before you came to the forum. And finally, as we say goodbye, we'd like to thank the following people for their generosity in making the St. Helena Forum and its continuing programs possible.